Good afternoon and welcome to the IAS, the hybrid version of the IAS and also the in-person version of the IAS. My name is Marcia Meskin and I'm the director of the Institute of Advanced Studies, and I'm really pleased to welcome you both if you're joining us online and those of you who are joining us in the space. The people who have been joining us in the space have had a packed morning already and now an afternoon and have been lively the whole time as far as I can tell. So we are anticipating a very exciting and interesting session. If you are coming into the Zoom space, let me give you a little bit of housekeeping first, and then I'll do a few brief introductions and welcomes. You will see that you have both a Q&A and a chat function in the webinar, and you are welcome to use both of those functions during the time that the seminar is running, and we will make sure that your questions, your comments are fed into the discussion. The afternoon session is going to be effectively in two parts. There'll be two papers, and then there will be a brief break. Again, if you're in the online session, you also will be informed around the timing of the break and when you're coming back in, so that everyone can have a comfort break in the session, and then rejoin for a very lively conversation. So we will notify you of that. With that said, it is my absolute pleasure, and I've been really looking forward to this event, to welcome you to Disasters, Memory and Memorials, and to welcome two visiting fellows, Professor Scott Knowles from the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, who is an historian of disaster worldwide and co-editor of a new journal, Journal of Disaster Studies, and Dr. Jacob Greens from New York University, who is historian of modern North America and director of the Initiative for Critical Disaster Studies. It's a real pleasure to welcome them, and they are hosted by two of my colleagues, one of whom is unable to be here today, Emily Keatley from Social Sciences and Humanities, but also Professor Ksenia Chmitina, who is here today and will be managing the conversation and the dialogue today. And I'll be delighted to be turning over to Ksenia shortly. I just want to say a few things really, which is basically that the Institute of Advanced Studies is the main hub of the university for international fellowship and international dialogue on a range of issues. And one of the things that we really love about the Institute is the way in which it brings together colleagues from different kinds of disciplinary backgrounds and enables dialogues that are incredibly wide-ranging. And I think today is really, really interesting for this. There are so many ways into the topics that we're going to look at today. Disaster risk studies, memory studies, heritage, questions around vernacular memorial practices, and the objects that we have in many instances here. And crucially, kind of the role of kind of cultural and personal trauma in histories and in memorial and memory studies. And I'm really quite interested in the idea of these intersections between the personal and the social and these sorts of practices that we're going to look at. So we are hoping that we're going to open up a conversation that doesn't have a disciplinary boundary and also brings us into a very worldwide set of questions and practices today. So we're looking forward to the global and to the disciplinary frames. And with that said, we're very happy to welcome our colleagues, and I'm turning over now to Ksenia.
Thank you so much, Marcia, and welcome everyone. What's going to be a set of fascinating talks. I've spoken to both Scott and Jacob about the content, so it's very exciting. Emily and I have been thinking about disasters and memory for a very long time. And the questions we were asking ourselves is, so why do we remember some disasters and not others? What makes us remember disasters? Who remembers? And what are the politics of disasters that kind of make us see them in a particular way? In disaster studies and kind of the disaster thought that I come from, we don't see disasters as events, nor do we see disasters as something natural. We see disasters as a very long political processes that have started decades, if not centuries ago, and that is simply, when disaster happens, it is just a manifestation of everyday inequality that affects the most marginalized people the most. So if that is the case, then what it is we're trying to remember when we talk about memory and disasters? Are we remember the people? Are we remembering the event? And I use quotation marks here. And if it's the event, then do we really need to kind of remember an earthquake or a flood, or is there something more to that? So what are the ways of us kind of trying to remember and to misremember and to deal with trauma that so many people then have to live with after a disaster or during a disaster. So many questions that we've kind of tried to discuss this morning at the workshop, and that I think Jacob and Scott will be touching upon in their presentations. I don't want to talk for any longer. So we will have two presentations first. So Scott, then little break, then Jacob, and we will open then the Q&A for both of them together. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and comments. Scott, over to you. Super excited to have you here. Thank you so much.
I jump up. Don't be surprised. All right, well, first of all, thank you all for being here, and thank Emily and Cinia for the invitation, and to the whole IAS community for making things easy to get here and to enjoy this conversation so far, and thanks to Marcia. So this is a work in progress that I hope will reach back into some of the conversation that we had this morning. I'm a historian, but I'm also trying to acquaint myself with memory studies as a way to actually be a partner with bereaved families in South Korea. I'll say more about that as I go along, but let me actually start at my junior high school. This is my junior high school in Arlington, Texas, which is a city you haven't heard of, between Dallas and Fort Worth, Texas. We're the Charles W. Young Junior High School Eagles. And I was in 7th grade in 1986. I was on the football team. It's the only year I made the team. And I remember a lot of things about junior high, not all good, not all bad. One of the clearest memories I have is January 28th, 1986. I was in my Texas history class, required class, junior high students, Texas. And they wheeled in a television set. We used to do that once in a while. Wheel in a full, imagine a box, not a flat screen. And we, like many millions of school children around America, were going to watch the first teacher go into space, Crystal McAuliffe. And not long into watching it, was clear that something had gone wrong. It wasn't as clear to us that what had gone on or that what we were watching on the screen was the thing that had gone wrong. It was the reaction of the teacher who turned the program off. And then we were a little mystified as to what had happened. And in fact, only when I got home from school that day and I talked to a friend of mine who had skipped school that day, he watched all of it, and he watched all of the news programming that followed it. And what he described was one of the defining moments that year and that era. And I think it touched people certainly around the world. It certainly touched teachers and school children who were really invested in this sort of democratization of space flight and this first teacher into space, and the idea that this event was going to be watched live by children who should be doing something else, but they were getting away with something by watching something interesting at school. And these images are from the New York Times, and this image that you see in the bottom right is actually from Crystal McAuliffe's school. Those were her students in New Hampshire. Well, this event has been very widely memorialized. But one of the challenges, of course, is where do you memorialize the explosion of a spaceship? Where's the physical place that we do that? And you may know there were a series of very public hearings and investigations that happened in the United States that lasted a long period after that. People could actually watch the investigation itself. And what that raised is, I wouldn't have had the tools to think about it this way at that time, but that disaster was a long time in the making. That explosion that we witnessed around the world, and was witnessed by these millions of school children, was something that actually was a reflection of engineering decisions, funding decisions, or lack of funding decisions at NASA that stretched back a long period of time. Today, there are over 40 schools in America that are named for Crystal McAuliffe. And there are a variety of formal and then also quite informal memorials to her all across the country. I didn't look to see if there were in other countries. Some of them are also very participatory. You see here the mosaic made by students. That's from a school in Chicago. Some of them look like NASA patches, the McAuliffe Elementary Challengers. The reason I wanted to start with that in my discussion today is going to be about schools as specific places to investigate power of disaster memory. Say power, I mean political power of disaster. And to do that, I need to start with, so I wanted to start with my own experience. Experiencing a disaster in a school, but the disaster didn't happen in my school. And yet it still was one of the most formative experiences of my life, to the point at which I felt like I could go to another country and talk to you about it. I mean, it's still that important to me. When I think about how to bring some analytics to disaster, I have some slides that I have to show. I'm going to actually just show a couple here to kind of let you know where I'm coming. And so the first thing I want to say in terms of how I think about what disaster is that it's not an event, it's a process, social and cultural process with contexts which are not, they're not readily apparent. They require investigation and framing, and in fact, they're contentious. Disaster, defining what a disaster was, when it happened, where it happened, who should ask that question, who should collect the materials, all of that exists within a political, which requires an extraordinary amount of labor to make sense of in its own moment, not to mention making sense of disasters that might have happened even last year or 100 years ago, or projecting the kinds of disasters that might come in the future in the Andes. Slow disaster concept is what I use. I think it's a kind of a cousin to Rob Nixon's slow violence idea, although I talk about slow disaster because I think disaster itself is a word that's a battleground, and I want to be in that battle. And so when I say slow disaster, I'm intentionally pushing back on the conventional notion of a disaster as an event, easily fixed in time and place, that has a resolution, a beginning, middle, and an end. It's cinematic in that sense. And memorialization is generally, if it's considered at all, in emergency management communities or in well-funded disaster research centers, memorialization might be considered a sort of add-on appendage at the very end of a recovery process. When most disaster experts and most people in disaster governance talk about disaster, they talk about, I think this is true in the UK, it's certainly true in the United States and South Korea, where I live now, they talk about phases of disaster. Talk about long pre-disaster periods, mitigation, preparedness, disaster events themselves, and then the recovery. I'm interested in investigating the possibility that memorialization must be considered interwoven into that entire life cycle. I'm actually not really life cycle itself of a disaster, because we're interested in a sort of alinear story, but we have to also be able to engage with, document and engage with storytelling in all of its different modes. So memorialization, as analyzed here by Amy Sodero, who's a sociologist who studies disaster memorials in the United States, she points to memorial museums, the formation of memorial museums, as a kind of a end point of a process. So we have the disaster unfolding over a period of time, and then we have recovery. And then we might have a series also of sort of discernible moments where meaning is made that we would call memorialization. And at the beginning, like this image in the bottom left, it might be mass action. It might be specific political acts that bereaved families or survivors will bring to government, a petition, literally in Korea, a petition to the government. We'd like you to pass a law that requires scientists to investigate the sinking of the Sewol ferry so that we will actually know why our children died. Very clear petition. That's what's happening here in the bottom left, which, according to Sodero's formulation, will conclude with something that looks like the image on the top left, which is the artist's rendering of the 416, that's April 16th, the date that the disaster, of the 416 Life and Safety Park, which will be the formal national memorial to the Sewol ferry disaster. If you're not as familiar, this is a ferry that was on its way from Incheon, the port of Incheon, South Korea, to Jeju Island, popular vacation spot, with over 300 people on the ship, 250 of whom were students from the Danwon High School. They were making their junior trip as a group, and only a handful of them survived the sinking of the ship. The ship sank in rough waters, predictably rough waters, off the southern coast of South Korea. I think there's a lot of utility in trying to bring some temporal structure. Just by studying disasters empirically and disaster memorials empirically, we can say, yeah, they do seem to begin with sort of almost ephemera, missing posters and handmade signs, and oral history is collected, and videos and photographs and many, many different things, which then become something that looks quite formal and that might even be funded by the state. It might become so formal that it becomes part of the state apparatus itself, in the formation of a museum that has a fixed collection, so that people who've never heard of this disaster before can walk in, be educated about what it is, and leave with some sort of a message as to how what they've just learned can be turned into good citizenship. And that's the goal of the 416 Life and Safety Park. But what's often left out of that story is the intense political environment that precedes that, runs through that, and then runs after that. And I'll just give you one little data point here, which is that the 416 Life and Safety Park was supposed to be open in time for the 10th anniversary of the Sewol ferry disaster, which is coming up April 16th of this year, but they haven't broken ground yet. And it could have broken ground, but the funding has been withdrawn twice now, and that's a matter of budgets and deeply political instruments, particularly in a centralized system like South Korea. So what's happening here from the bereaved families' perspective is the government has now turned its back on the Sewol story, and they're hoping maybe that the political support for the families will drain away after the 10th anniversary, and they might get away with not building the memorial at all. I don't know if that's true or not, but that is a common feeling right now among the Sewol bereaved families, who are highly organized. And so they're trying to puzzle through how to take action. This 10th anniversary is coming. Anniversaries are a time when newspapers dispatch reporters to take pictures, to interview families again. They have a moment, some of them feel they have one more moment to try to tell their story before the world stops paying attention. These anniversaries are not just marking time, they're deeply political events. And when I say political, it transcends, usually transcends party. We're talking, politics, I think, in a sense in which we have a group of people who are trying, in Korea at least, we're trying to articulate failure of the state, which transcends party. This is a fundamental failure of the state to exercise care and caution for children. And that's a politics in Korea which taps into a deeper critique of the state that has to do with the emergence of democracy. South Korea is a relatively new democracy. It went through a painful 20-year period of democratization in which there are many cases in which the state, which soldiers killed protesters, high school students, college students, making that leap from the Gwangju massacre, for example, democracy uprisings of the 1980s and 1990s to Sewol is not much of a leap at all for the Sewol families. That's the kind of politics here. And it's ultimately a politics of memorialization. So what they choose, which stories they choose to tell, what structures they choose to get behind, or what memorials, as I'm going to show you here, they decide to build and put forward to the world. It's not, those are a series of choices and curatorial moves which have a longer term policy. Now, I'm a historian, so I really got to control myself with this. So let me just give you one slide. I want to bring it now. I want to talk about schools. I want to talk about the unique opportunity to look at schools as places where memorials are curated and as sites of political sort of activity around policy demands in the aftermath of disaster. So schools are, not surprisingly, sites that have a lot of disaster history. And the images I show you are just from left to right. These are children in the United States practicing their duck and cover drills, right? So their teachers are instructing them here how to survive a nuclear attack. When I saw these kind of images, I think I felt I really had a deeper understanding of my parents. Because they were told by adults that you will survive a nuclear attack if you just get under your desk. Fires in schools were some of the most important spurs to action among fire safety professionals in the fire service and government throughout the 19th and 20th century in the United States. These are places where some of the first innovations in stairwell widths and doors that open outward, and I could give you 100 other examples of kinds of things that were tried in schools so that children could get out of schools easily. And there was often a sort of relationship, a sort of event to policy change relationship. Events do sometimes. The third image there is actually, these are teachers who were killed in the Iroquois theater fire. That was the largest loss of life of any fire in America in the 20th century. It was 1903. There was a theater fire in Chicago, and it was held during the Christmas break. They were watching a play during the Christmas break. The exit doors opened in, the exits were marked. Over 600 people died in this fire. Mostly they were school kids. And so sometimes the disaster of the school doesn't take place in the school. It's the community of teachers and students who die. But it's still a coherent identity around the teachers and student relationship. And so these are the heroic teachers who died, who were not able to convey the children the safety. And just to tag on to what I was saying a minute ago about the importance of disaster and fire, particularly NATO, where I'm from, to material change, structural change in the law and in the school design. Philadelphia has had a huge problem in the last 10 years with asbestos abatement because the material which was invented to reduce fires on ships and in schools and in hospitals turns out, fortunately, to crack and get in the air and cause lung disease. That's asbestos. So sometimes if you follow the long arc of a disaster, you create a new public health disaster as you're dealing with the old disaster. I just want to add one more piece to this, and this is a callback to some of the territory we were traversing this morning. We think about, and this is kind of going back a little bit to the Challenger example, this is some research about the role of the Challenger disaster, the effect of it on children. And I would be one of these, although I wasn't interviewed for this, using the concept of distant trauma. So not just assessing the need for disaster memory or memorial as to mark the death of a famous teacher, but also to try to create a scientific apparatus to understand actually how we would call it PTSD now, how these children's lives, psyches were shaped by what they watched on television. Okay, so memory school. The school, it's worth taking a moment to think about. Hopefully you say school, maybe you smile, you think you certainly have memories. There's no doubt about it, good or bad, mixed for most of us. But the school is a commons, even private schools. And it's also functions, certainly in the United States and in Korea, as a town square. Most elections are held, the actual voting is held in schools. It's a point of refuge, a place where children who don't have resources get school lunch assistance, where they might have the protection of a teacher, where they might actually first be noticed as having the signs of child abuse. School is a point of refuge, a symbol of progress for a community or regress, and an index of social capital. So much so that school funding is generally in the United States directly tied to the wealth or lack of that community. It's also a site for psychological, social, and emotional development. And the school community exists away from the school building. So when I talk about memory school and memorials in schools, I want to engage a discussion about the challenge of memorialization for what is a coherent group of people, even though they're not in the place that they're supposed to be, that gives them coherence. And if you think about, couldn't this apply more broadly than a school? I think there probably are examples. The closest I can think of would be people who are in the same military talk about their service and their community as being somehow connected to a physical place, but it can also be disconnected from that place as well. But we don't think necessarily like this about, your workplace. The workplace might check some of these boxes, but the community that's formed around the psychological, social, emotional development that happens in the school creates a uniquely durable community. Some of the ideas that I am trying to document here, and I'm going to show you some different examples for it here in a moment. The way that schools function as sites of grieving for bereaved families. This would be obvious if a disaster happened at a school, but also happens quite frequently if the school children, there's some sort of disaster that happens that affects children or teachers away from school. I'm going to show you an example from South Korea where the bereaved families are explicitly using the classroom as a place to teach they see themselves teaching other people how to, people who might be victims of distant trauma, who might not have yet processed their feelings about this. Say, well, Ferry, where would be the best place for you to do that? Come to this memory school we've created for you to have this experience, a sort of proxy. It's also, as I mentioned before, the elevation of a school to memorial it's an inherently political act, and one that can cause a lot of dissent and argument within the community. Let me start then with, so this is what's on the table, and I'm working on this project, and that's kind of the conceptual apparatus I'm working with now, and I'm trying to find empirical cases where the school is a sort of central focus of how memory will be produced and curated, and how it will be fought for, and the kinds of policy remedies that will come or not come will have a lot to do with whether or not the school itself functions well as a or as a memorial community. So in the United States, actually, I'm just going to show this first. School shootings in the United States have reached epidemic proportion. It's a disaster of enormous scale and reach. No community has been untouched. No state has been untouched in the United States. This trend has happened over my lifetime, so it's something that actually continually gotten worse and worse, and it also demonstrates the need for close attention, I think, to social context with disaster and cultural context, because we know everything we need to know to reduce deaths from gun violence at schools. We could easily bring that number down to zero, but the number has gone up. So there's some sort of disruption here between knowledge formation and the disaster and losses. It doesn't work in a we know more and get it done kind of relationship. This is the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. Uvalde is a community about an hour southwest of San Antonio. And when you visit the Robb Elementary School, which is now disused, sits empty, there's fencing around it. And the day I went to look at it, I walked around two sides of the school. And by the time I had made it to the second side, a sheriff's deputy was following me in an unmarked car because they're actively monitoring the school for a variety of reasons, one of which has to do with there's a very large conspiracy culture in the United States, which argues that this event never happened. The shooting in the school was actually perpetrated by the United States government that used actors, paid children to be actors. I see by the horrified looks on some of your faces that you haven't heard about necessarily the false flag conspiracy theory in the United States. And the argument here is that the government does these on a regular basis because the ultimate goal of the state in the United States is to take your guns away. And so what they're really worried about is not a rogue historian walking around. They might be worried, but they're more worried that I'm going to go there and do some sort of live blog, live stream, and try to, who knows what I might do if I of that momentum. So this is the Robb Elementary School So the violence happened at the school. And that creates a unique problem because the challenge is, well, should you preserve the school building itself? I mean, the first problem is sort of structural material. Do we save the school? In a lower income community like Uvalde, tearing down a school is not a small thing, right? This has real tax implications for the community. Just getting rid of a school is not something you would do lightly. If a tornado hit this Robb Elementary School, they'd rebuild it. But mass shooting has caused an ambivalence about what should happen to the physical building itself. The memorials that you see here are the informal ones. So there is not a formal school shooting memorial yet. And there's tension in the community as to whether or not one will be built, because many people conflate the construction of a school shooting memorial with an anti-gun politics. And so even though you might be grieving for the children of your community, if you agree to the construction of that memorial, you are de facto saying gun control is the policy path forward out of that memorialization. The community itself is full of these murals. If you go to downtown Uvalde, you'll see the photos of the children on the right. That's from the newspaper, but the images in the bottom center there, those are paintings of the children, which come from murals and walls all around the center of Uvalde. Uvalde is a ghost town. The downtown is not in use anymore. Basically, there's a lot of empty walls, and these walls are now festooned with these beautiful pictures. And if you didn't know what you were seeing just driving through town, you would think this is a community that has a lot of love and support for its elementary school students. And of course, that is true. It's just that all of these children died in the hands of the shooting. In other cases, the communities have decided to tear down those schools. This is Sandy Hook Memorial in Connecticut. And they built this memorial. And again, this was a point of great consternation and argument within the community itself as to whether or not they could afford to tear down a school. But the school was so, I mean, it looked like a battle had happened. The school was so damaged. They did end up destroying the entire school building and building another new school. This is an aerial view of the memorial, which opened long ago. There's other examples that Columbine High School in Colorado, for example, there was a mass shooting in 1999. On the 20th anniversary, they talked then about tearing down the school. Now that may seem weird to you. Why would you talk in 2019 about tearing down the school? But they were deeply concerned that on that anniversary, there would be an influx of dark tourism and false flag agitators who would come. This is the height of the Trump moment. And they would come and they would demonstrate, or they would take objects from the school, they would deface it in some way. And so the argument was, let's tear it down to avoid this problem. They ended up not doing it. Another example from completely the other side of the world, this is Phnom Penh, Cambodia. This is the 12 Sling site. This is a former school complex in the center of Phnom Penh, which when the Khmer Rouge came to power in 1976, they took the school expressly because it was a school. You may know something about the terror tactics that were used by the Khmer Rouge regime in Pol Pot. It was an agrarian, Marxist agrarian philosophy, violent philosophy, murderous philosophy that led to the interrogation, torture, and murder of millions of people. And anyone who had an education was suspect, and schools were by definition suspect. But they didn't just tear down schools, they used schools intentionally as torture sites. And so this school, and there's a horror to it that when you go there, some things become very clear because the school's well built. School has an internal courtyard. You can do all kinds of things out of the sight of people who are trying to peer inside. And the individual classrooms are the perfect size for interrogations. This has all been, so this is now the central place. If you go to Phnom Penh to study the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge regime, you will go here to this school. And I was floored. I knew a little bit about it, but actually go there. And like me, you might be like me, in my first experience, always when I go into something that even just looks like a school, I have a feel good. there's something about the architecture of a school that resonates deeply with me. And the second you're inside there, you realize the sort of psychological travesty that's perpetrated. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Sewol Ferry. So in the Sewol Ferry case, we have trauma, a disaster that occurred away from the school. The death of the 250 children in the Danwon High School happened a couple hundred miles away in the sea. So where to put the memorial has been a kind of a central challenge about this disaster. It was the defining political moment of its time, of this time in Korea. The president of the country, you may know, went to prison just 2 years after this disaster for corruption charges, but it's not unconnected to her role or her lack of action during the Sewol Ferry disaster. In fact, the president was not accountable that day. And Korea has an emergency management system in which the president is actually called upon in major disasters. The president's office actually has a central role, and she was not available that day. And that's a central sticking point for families. They still want to know where she was. No answer. So where do you put the memorial? This is the site of Pengmok Port. So this is the place where if you were told that you had one of your child had been killed in the disaster, you went here and you waited for them to bring the bodies up from the bottom of the sea, and then you identified them here in front of this red lighthouse. So, but what you had were parents who all knew each other because they were all parents of children in the same school. So you had this disaster school coherence of this community. That's what was drawing them together. In fact, they just found recently, they stayed in a gymnasium. And a lot of times they would segregate themselves according to the school, the classroom. So they would be in the same part of the gym with other parents who were in the same class that their kids had been. Right? So they were sorting according to the logic of the school, which was in Ansan, which is quite to be on the ship. And the government of Korea undertook an extraordinary effort to actually, the largest ship that was ever raised in one piece from the seafloor. And it's actually, this is an old video, but the ship is now erect. It's been brought up. It's massive. You ever see a ship out of the water? It's a big ship. And it's at the port, the Mokpo port. It sits there. You can go see it, but they're very ambivalent sort of as to whether or not this should be a memorial site. It's still kind of dangerous. It's hard to go into. They'd have to build a big structure and spend a lot of money to take you inside. And so the centerpiece, or the place that the families would like to take you, and I hope you all get a chance to come to KAIST, come to Korea, attend one of our disaster Hakkyo schools, and come with us to this place, is that they took the 17 classrooms that the students studied in, and they dismantled the classrooms from the school, piece by piece, chair by chair, desk by desk, ceiling tile by ceiling tile, clock, fan, everything was removed and brought to an interim structure. First place I saw it was the interim building. They rebuilt all of it. And then the city government said, you can't use that structure anymore. And so they raised money and they built a dedicated building, which looks like a school building, but it's not. It's a memorial museum building with a school rebuilt inside of it. And this is what they call this is the memory classroom. And so you're free to walk through, sit in the chairs, leave notes for the students. They have, for the parents who want to participate, and most of them do, there might be things on the desk telling you what college or university the student wanted to attend, what kind of snacks they like to eat. It's an intensely moving experience. It's supposed to bring you to some sort of catharsis, so that when you're done in the memory classroom, you ask yourself, why are these school seats empty? Where are those children? And what can I do about it? How much time do I have left? 10 minutes. Wow, a bounty. Let me offer, so we'll leave South Korea, and we're moving quite fast. I realize we've been in Uvalde and Cambodia, South Korea, and now we'll go to Japan. And so what I want to show you here, in our last disaster Hakio last summer, the participants went to Ansan, and so we went to the different memorial sites and spent a lot of time at the memory classroom there in Ansan, and then we went to Fukushima Prefecture in Japan. And this was actually not planned. I wish I could say it was. We planned to go there. We planned to go to this museum, the East Japan Earthquake and Nuclear Disaster Memorial Museum, which is the largest museum of the triple disaster, which was, as you know, an earthquake, tsunami, and some part of the region, a nuclear disaster. And that was the plan to go and visit that site. What you're seeing here is a space that used to be a densely packed village, but is now left open because for memorial purposes and also for tsunami mitigation purposes. The museum itself is, I think it's fair to say, anti-nuclear power, holds the government to account for failures of safety in terms of seismicity, in terms of tsunami, and in terms of nuclear power protection. And even though the museum itself is not a school, they chose a number of school artifacts, including one room, which is completely, it's a mishmash of different school classrooms, lockers, photos of various schools in various states of disrepair, and the chalkboard. And I just want to come back to this. Oh, it's not in that one. Yeah, there we are. So the image on your right here. So again, we're back in Ansan, and that's my colleague Chiyoung John and Buja Chung, who's one of the most active of the bereaved family members in promoting the learning process that goes on at the memory classroom. And the chalkboards are of really central importance because the chalkboards are untouched. In some places, they put plastic over to actually preserve. In other cases, they've reconstructed from photographs what was on the chalkboard. So it's as if those students left those seats, left that room, and never returned. That they're trying to freeze time in that way. And that's the same process that's at work here. And I spent some time in that room, and I was really fascinated myself, sort of autoethnography, but really more just watching people, how many people really, of all the things that were in that room, how many of them grappled with that chalkboard? Really stopped and spent time sort of looking at the chalkboard. There's something about that artifact. I mean, maybe because it's so quintessentially something you would only encounter in that kind of a classroom, where you can imagine the important moments in your own life that were mediated through this very low tech kind of artifact. It's maybe easy then to substitute yourself into that space. And we then went to two different elementary schools in the town of Ishinomaki. Ishinomaki was not damaged by the nuclear power disaster, but it was deeply affected by the earthquake and tsunami. The first place we went was to the Okawa Elementary School, and the Okawa Elementary School was it was damaged. The building itself was damaged by earthquake, and then the children and the teachers escaped the building. But then there was some lack of understanding about where they should exactly go to get away from potential tsunami. And they weren't that worried about the tsunami because they're not exactly on the coast, they're on a river. So you can see just in the background, you can see that river way behind them. But within a pretty short period of time, the river surged, and in fact, a wall of water came over the top of the school building. Some of the children and their teachers went up the mountainside. Others of them went into the town. All of the ones that went into the town died. There's a book called Ghosts of the Tsunami that tells this entire story if you want to read more about it. The school itself today is preserved by the bereaved families who fought very hard against the government's desire to close this site or destroy this site, but they have demanded, and they've won for now, dispensation to keep it as a disaster site, which is a ruin that you can go and visit. You can't physically go in, but you can look in, and what you're looking into there are the classrooms, and what's left in the classrooms, the chalkboard. And then you can go on the mountainside above, and you can see down into the school itself. And you can imagine the violence that was experienced in this spot. And you go just a few miles away to the Ishinomaki Elementary School, same disaster, same prefecture, same town. Here, what happened was a wall of water came in and it destroyed the entire neighborhood in front of the school. You may remember even from Fukushima, this was very much reproduced in the news media. The school itself sits with a kind of mountain behind it. And the wall of water came in and brought this huge wall of debris up to the front of the school, and then a fire started. The fire burned through the school and destroyed most of the interior of the school, but by then the students had been evacuated. And from the government's perspective, and this was interpreted for us from survivors, children, students, is that this is the story the government is desperate to tell, because in this instance, government planning was perfect. Everybody followed the plan. We knew how to evacuate, we knew how to get to safety, and this has also been turned into a memorial museum with much more limited engagement of survivor families and students. And we talked to some students after they walked us through this, and they have very mixed feelings. This is their school. They're glad the school has been preserved. They're glad they have a role to play in telling the story about that day. But they also expressed that they're a little bit unsettled by the idea that this is being held up as a sort of prototype of how the government can, and should prepare for disasters of this type in the future in Japan. So let me just conclude, and coming back to some of the conceptual points I was making at the top, one of the challenges of memorialization anywhere, but I think particularly for bereaved parents, have to do with persistence. How long will a disaster last? Well, for parents, it will last at least until the bodies of their children are recovered. Not all of the say, well, fairy children's bodies have been recovered, but of course it will last much longer than that. And so what role can memorialization play in reducing their trauma? I was chatting with a couple of people in the break before this. That's one of the things that I have to say, I myself have drawn into this work with a kind of a mutual aid philosophy that I do believe academics and museums have a role. We can participate. We have a role to play. We have a lot more resources than we often give ourselves credit for. We can do a lot of work with them. We can agitate on their behalf. There's many, many things we can do in a support role. We should also be very clear what we can't do, or what we're not going to be able to do. I think that kind of discussion is very important methodologically when you start this kind of work. But you know, ultimately the thing that I wasn't critical enough about at the beginning was this sort of idea that the memorial, the creation of the memorial, thinking back to Amy Sodero's idea, there was an internal logic to this, a temporal logic. They were going to proceed through some steps, which were similar to steps of psychiatric recovery. And that the formation of the memorial museum would mark for them some moment of a return to their, I don't know, health is too strong, but to something that might look like normalcy in their lives. And I'm not as convinced by that at all anymore. And in fact, what I've seen more and more is that there's a kind of governmentality which takes that idea and makes it instrumental and funds things on their behalf that they haven't even asked for. I showed you this site. I promise I'm concluding. But here, what I'm not showing you here is there's a beautiful new marine safety training center, which the government has paid for at Pengmok, and the government built an amazing memorial statue of a grieving mother. The families had no input at all. They were never just, none of this was discussed with them. It was built on their behalf with money that was appropriated by the government, I think in some ways to dispense with the moral weight of what's owed to the Sewell families. I think when I have had the opportunity to speak and do interviews over a long period of time with the bereaved mothers and fathers, they talk much more about the community that they have built and sustained among themselves as an intensely difficult labor. And nevertheless, they commit to it. There's a constant vigil at Pengmok. there's always a bereaved family member there. Until all of the children have been recovered, they've made that pledge. Now the 10th anniversary is coming. Will it continue beyond that? I think it probably will. And just the final thought here is that these issues are not one, so we've talked at different scales and different sort of levels and different sort of distance from the trauma. People who are in the school building, people who are of the school community but experience disaster remotely from the school, people who are traumatized from a distance who didn't even go to that school. We've just lived through the greatest school impacted mass disaster since World War II. And there's a lot of guidance out there. I've started collecting some of it that a lot of children's hospitals, actually, this is from the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, how to create virtual memorials during the COVID pandemic as an anti-depression tool for students who are stuck at home doing Zoom school. Right? So there was a lot of concern in that first year of the psychiatric, as well there should have been, the psychiatric impact of students who were experiencing the global pandemic, but they were experiencing it at home, but they were still experiencing it as part of a school community. And in the United States, I don't think you had this, maybe you had this here, I don't know, you didn't have this in Korea. Schools were also the places, and school board meetings were the places where parents and their children, I can't believe they did this of their own accord, maybe they did, would protest against having to wear masks, would protest against having COVID testing, would protest against the mere existence of COVID. The school was the most important place to do that kind of protest, which again, to me is an index that when we want to think about memory, memorialization, and disaster history, schools are special places and we should attend to them very closely. And I'll stop my comments there.